Since Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, it was possible to observe many different narratives being pushed by different sides of the conflict. In the same manner, there are different actors within different countries that present different positions related to this conflict. And in truth, it's a highly complex matter to be discussed and to be analyzed because there are so many parties involved, there are so many different interests involved. But one cannot run away from the general narrative of Russia very, very bad, attacked, unprovoked a neighboring country, whereas Ukraine, EU, and the US are good Samaritans who are helping Ukraine win the war with an invader. My position is that this is not the case, and everyone involved played a part in the escalation of this conflict. While I believe that this conflict has its roots in centuries of history, the actual breaking point has occurred because of international trade and incompatibility of views and the incapacity of different actors involved at the time to find a more pragmatic solution that would fit all the parties and would allow them to find a compromise. So let's dive in. Around 2007 and 2008, both the EU and Russia proposed to Ukraine separate trade agreements. Russia, especially under Putin, always sought to keep the post-Soviet space under its wing. And considering the different historical factors, as well as proximity in regulatory systems, at the time this made sense because all of the different countries in a post-Soviet space were still deeply integrated with each other, whether it be through business, whether it be through specific norms, as well as just the general cultural proximity because everybody spoke Russian. So around 2007, 2008, Russia has proposed a Eurasian Customs Union framework called CIS, a Commonwealth of Independent States, which was essentially meant to eliminate all the tariffs amongst some of the post-Soviet countries, whereas at the same time, the European Union proposed to Ukraine an association agreement, which in theory would also mean economic integration and free trade between the European Union and Ukraine. In this context, I do believe that it's important to mention that both Russia and Ukraine, given their geographic position, have always had difficulties placing themselves as European or Asian, because there has always been this push and pull in terms of which civilization they were more part of, the European one or the Asian one. And you might ask, well, why do they have to choose? They potentially could just establish relations with both. And of course, there is an element of cooperation of different actors and different territories, etc., given they are neighbors. But considering that those both continents hold almost very opposing views in relation to the systems, the political systems they are building, as well as ideological expression of their cultures, that proximity to one or the other almost pushes them into different directions. So when we further go and explore this topic, please remember that it has always been a complex conundrum. Also for the fact that China and Asia at large represent quite a big, substantial geopolitical power. Same goes for Europe, especially now that the European countries have allied themselves into a European Union, because let's also not forget that the different ambitions on the bigger actors within Europe itself created a grand power dynamics where countries like France, Germany, and the United Kingdom have always sought more expansionist and more imperial expression of their identity. Now that, of course, they've been pulled together in the European Commission, the system is created to make them avoid fighting amongst each other. But let's not forget that within the EU, some countries still hold bigger power, although this is, of course, unspoken. And it's still related to to those past remnants of great power dynamics that we have inherited post Second World War. And speaking of inheritance, let's also not forget that Russia has inherited quite a bit of a distrust. For 300 years, European countries have looked at Russia in varied ways, and both territories always competed with each other for power, for influence, for resources. So both territories have always represented a certain threat for each other, which inevitably will be imprinted in the collective memory and the collective consciousness of different countries in their respective cultures, which of course will eventually end up being expressed in their ideologies and in their policies. So around 2008 to 2007, 2008, those two different treaties were proposed to Ukraine, and Ukraine was in position to choose whether to ally itself to Russia, or whether to, let's say, continue aligning itself to Russia, or whether to move closer to Europe. In legal terms, nobody told Ukraine that if it chose one, it could not choose the other. But in practical terms, it was clear that the legal measures imposed by both treaties could not be applied in coordination. So what the EU association agreement dictated was that Ukraine would need to adopt about 80% of the acquis communautaire of the European Union, which was somewhat a measure used by the European Union to deeply integrate Ukraine into its regulatory system. This would mean that Ukraine would need to align its laws, majority of its laws, with the European Union laws. This was related to food safety, labor laws, public procurement, intellectual property, sanitary and phytosanitary standards, manufacturing standards, environmental standards, which meant quite a lot of work. In the same manner, a lot of people in Ukraine picked this association agreement as an invitation of Ukraine into the European Union, which was not at all the case. No one promised Ukraine additional funds for its development. No one promised Ukraine deep and integrated assistance in relation to its regulatory changes. No one offered the Ukrainians free passage to the Schengen area. At the time, this was meant to be a step towards integration of Ukraine with the EU's trading rules. For Europe, this was a highly pragmatic way of expanding its economic sphere of influence. Europe was not doing this out of goodness of its heart. Europe wanted a 45 million Ukrainian market. Europe wanted to export its machinery, its cars, and some other goods, while not necessarily offering Ukraine those same conditions, because the Ukrainian market at the time, the Ukraine production at the time, was very much linked to the Russian market and the somewhat outdated Soviet-era GOST technical standards. Moscow at the time expressed its discontent and did attempt to reason with Ukraine, trying to push them towards their own side and explaining that should they join the European Union, this would not only impact the Ukrainian market, that in comparison to the European market was underdeveloped, but it would also have deep repercussions on the Russian market. In this regard, you might say that Russia had no business meddling with a sovereign country like Ukraine, and Ukraine was more than allowed and capable of associating itself with the partners it deemed fit. But that is not entirely the case, because, as I've already mentioned, Russian and Ukrainian markets were deeply integrated. Their borders were fundamentally inexistent up until 2010. There was literally no physical border to control the influx of European goods should this free trade agreement be concluded between Ukraine and the European Union. There was also a matter of protecting the Russian market from specific standards that would inevitably be imposed on Russia to then be able to trade with Ukraine. And so this would have an increasing impact on the Russian industries that were also underdeveloped in comparison to the European Union. Russia and Ukraine shared a highly interdependent military complex as well. At the time, quite a lot of military production was located in the Donbass, which is where all the fighting is happening at the moment. Losing control over these industries would represent a security risk for Russia as well. Then, of course, all of the NATO conversations were led. So the timeline of events goes like this. The actual propositions for these trade agreements between Ukraine and the EU, as well as Russia, came about into 2007 and 2008. Then, of course, they needed some time to draft those agreements, and so the agreements were actually ready around 2011. Ukraine eventually, after discussing both agreements, ended up signing the trade agreement with Russia. When the European agreement in 2012 was ready once again, because this was a never-ending game, where the European Union would actually push Ukraine to further evaluate that agreement, even though it was already integrating its market with Russia. The agreement contains strict chapters in relation to energy cooperation as well. By tying Ukraine to the EU energy laws, it was essentially attempting to control the pipelines that were passing through Ukraine from Russia and supplying natural gas to the European nations. Europe was highly reliant on Ukraine for corn to feed the Southern European livestock industries. They also imported large quantities of sunflower oil for European food and biodiesel processing. And so when Ukraine was to be deeply integrated with the EU market, the EU would essentially secure that crop for its businesses, keeping its agribusiness competitive. So let's also not discard the fact that the European crops have been suffering with the climate change, and southern countries like Spain and Italy, as well as southern France, have been suffering with successive droughts that generally devastate the domestic wheat, barley, and olive yields. Which means that as Europe's own agricultural output becomes more volatile, they have to rely on its partners for its resilient black soil. So this measure and this agreement would also be about food security for Europe. The Ukrainian market represented cheap labor as well, to which European industries could outsource labor to. Russia, of course, objected to this and tried to demand a dual system that would work for the three territories and that would allow a more balanced integration of Ukraine into the EU as well as the Russian market, considering again that they are neighbors, which then led to the Russia's retaliation because its position had not been noted in relation to the technical demands. So what Russia did is that it launched a trade war by tightening the border inspections, which heavily impacted the Ukrainian steel and chocolates exports to Russia. This in turn has made Yanukovych to suspend the preparation for the EU association agreement signature and consequently led to the Maidan protests. So because of Euromaidan demonstrations that the Ukrainian public has conducted, which by many was considered a revolution because the president at the time was deposed and had to flee to Russia, Ukraine ended up signing the association agreement in 2014. After that, there were separatist movements in Ukraine, where the Russian-speaking part of the East was essentially opposed to the new government, to the new demands of the West. The eastern part was considered to wanting to continue its relationship with Russia, considering that there were quite a lot of factories in that territory. And some of the Ukrainian speakers, of course, have mentioned that all of those factories were useless and they were not bringing any profits, and it was necessary to modernize. It was necessary to move forward and seek further development, even if that meant separation from the Russian economy and the Russian markets. The then Kiev regime, led by Poroshenko, did not accept those demands from the eastern part of Ukraine and considered those separatists terrorists who were funded by Russia to essentially stall this bright future trade agreement with the European Union, which was far more beneficial to Ukraine than what Russia was proposing. I don't want to enter into too much detail to what has happened after 2014 up until now, because obviously this has been in the news, and Russia is at the moment considered the invader. Ukraine has seen its integration with Europe much more deeply. But what I do want to say is that this conflict is primarily related to geopolitical ambitions and maintenance and expansion of spheres of influence. Ultimately, Europe and Russia, but also the US. I keep forgetting to mention the US because the US have somewhat moved away from this conflict at the moment, but they were fundamentally involved in pushing Europe to fight Russia, to be involved in this conflict. The US acted as a certain guarantor that back then it has declared Russia as NATO's main enemy. In recent years, let's also not forget that there were certain ambitions to explore the Ukraine's deep earth metals, and sometimes it seems to me that BlackRock will end up owning Ukraine. It is, of course, a tragedy that all of the people are dying because a pragmatic legal solution could not be found. But let's look at who seems to be winning with all of this. In my eyes, the US seem to be winning considerably. First, they saw the Russia-Europe relations fundamentally destroyed. And they've also pushed for Europe to not get too close to Russia, because then it would also lose its sphere of influence over Europe. The second point is that the US is supplying expensive, much more expensive oil and gas to Europe as well, instead of Russia, getting rid of all the competition. Europe is also buying US's weapons because US has decided to pull out of this conflict and is no longer supplying funds or weapons free of charge to Ukraine, fundamentally washing their hands of this mess. Would you take that deal? I'd take that deal. Who else is winning? The European Union is also winning because it managed to push the Ukraine closer to itself and further away from Russia. That was a big win in terms of trade. But in my eyes, this left Europe holding a monumentally expensive financial liability. Europe understands that rebuilding Ukraine will be extremely expensive. Some analysts are mentioning about 600 billion only in reconstruction fees, plus if Ukraine ends up being integrated into the European market, there will be charges related to the agricultural subsidies and other cohesion funds. This, of course, would represent budget cuts for other EU member states, turning the current fund receivers into net payers. Because let's not forget that Ukraine needs to be severely modernized. Let's also not forget the EU green standards, which will wage a massive war on what is possible to achieve in the short term. And despite knowing of these staggering costs, the EU keeps funding Ukraine, not only in terms of its defense capability, but also its general daily management of itself, because Ukraine is conducting war and is finding it difficult to keep its economy growing. And so the conflict at the moment persists as a high-stake realpolitik stalemate, where both sides are seeking to gain leverage for the eventual peace negotiations. Essential point of Deadlock is still who will be paying for Ukraine's reconstruction. Russia still has 300 billion of its assets frozen in the West, and the European countries can use interest on those funds to allocate some resources here and there. And let's not forget that Russia also holds some of the European corporate assets. The war continues because neither side has reached its breaking point. Neither side trusts the other side, and both sides require some type of security guarantees. Ukraine is also very much unwilling to give away Crimea and other of its regions, which was, in my eyes, was basically the payment that Russia demanded from Ukraine for moving closer to the European Union rather than staying home and maintaining the family ties. Sincerely, I do believe that this would have been a fair price to pay, all things considered, and the Minsk agreement that would grant the eastern Ukraine regions an autonomous status. What has Russia gained? So far, not much, but whatever identity crisis it may have had regarding its position between the East and the West, right now its strong allegiance to China will certainly dictate the international politics of Russia and China for the years to come. And of course, this is not necessarily good news for Europe nor the US. And if you think that attacking Russia's industrial oil capabilities will essentially end this war and not affect you, wherever you are in the world, you're very much mistaken. Because Russia is fundamentally involved in the international market where the quantities of oil and gas determine the prices of that oil and gas. And the fact that there will be considerably less oil and gas on the international markets will rise those prices up. In Europe, as well as Ukraine, will be impacted by their own burning Russian refineries. Zelensky, of course, is now working quite hard to guarantee EU accession, as he should, because Europe, since the beginning of the discussions related to the trade, were never actually willing to allow Ukraine as its member, because Europe also understands that Ukraine represents a huge financial liability and requires a lot of work in order to implement the huge array of regulatory structures. This would not only require putting those rules into law in Ukraine, but it would also require the actual physical, technical implementation, from training the staff, from implementing the processes, from making sure that everybody can adhere to that system. Obviously, this is not done in one day, or even a year or 2 years. This will be an extremely laborious and hard work for all the parties involved. I find it extremely interesting that Europe is currently going back to its further military ambitions. But I also cannot help but think that this is probably highly necessary, because Europe cannot rely on the US, because the US has pushed Europe to do things that were fundamentally against its interests.
And have the UN help glue it, and fuck the EU.
No, exactly, and I think we've got to do something to make it stick together, because you can be pretty sure that if it does start to gain altitude, the Russians will be working behind the scenes to try to torpedo it.
And so Europe now potentially may see itself to further exploit its military ambitions, and as soon as its military is at a higher level, we do not know whether it will revert to its historical memories regarding the grandiosity that Napoleon or Hitler did not achieve. We already see quite a movement towards the right-leaning parties in Europe because of all the immigration and the discontentment of the general public with the positions that EU leaders are taking. But again, let's not forget that by default, European countries are not allowed national interests. They always need to reach a point of agreement that fits all. And that, of course, generally leads to the fact that many of those countries need to forget about their own national interests for the benefit of all. That's why also there have been arguments against the expansion of the European Union, because more members will put a further strain on the remaining European Union members. I mean, let's remember Turkey, who has demonstrated interest in joining the EU since the late 80s. In any case, no matter what the conclusions are, no matter what your position is with regards to this conflict, I think the biggest objective is to not allow this conflict to expand to other territories. There have been different provocations to visibly involved other countries in this conflict. While, of course, we understand that there's a variety of countries participating on the battleground in Ukraine, for all effects and purposes, this conflict is still contained on those Ukrainian territories, despite the fact that it is a conflict between the West and the East. And no matter what, those countries should attempt to contain it as much as possible. Because I do not believe that anybody wants a World War III. But what I tell you is that the fundamental international relations landscape will be changed after this conflict. And we're all here for it. I, as a customs professional, will be accompanying this conflict very closely, especially when it comes to the different international trade regulations that will be adopted. If you need a professional customs consultation, please do not hesitate to contact me on my website. In the meantime, please let me know what you think. I know this is a very controversial topic, and it's hard to stay pragmatic because of the amount of suffering that it has caused. But please let me know what you think in the comments. Leave a like, subscribe, and thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.